I'm Besa Luce, and welcome to Other Talking Points, a K2.0 podcast. In this episode, we will be talking about the Association of Serb-Majority Municipalities in Kosovo. Agreed upon in 2013 as part of an agreement between Kosovo and Serbia within the EU-mediated dialogue for the normalization of relations, the association was promoted as a way to convince Kosovo Serbs to fully enter the Kosovar system, ensure their cultural autonomy, and end the Serbian state's parallel structures within Kosovo. Still unimplemented after a decade, it's been causing controversy since before it was signed. Following the initial 2013 agreement and a follow-up in 2015 that clarified some of the implementation details, Kosovo erupted in political turmoil. For weeks, in both years, the assembly was brought to a halt by the then opposition party Vetëvendosje, who argued that the association was a way for Serbia to undermine Kosovo's sovereignty. The 2015 protest initiated a review by the Constitutional Court in Kosovo, which paradoxically said that aspects of the guiding principles of the association were not in accordance with the Constitution, but that it was nevertheless a legal obligation for Kosovo. The association has also been a source of tension in Pristina's relationship with the international community, which has intensified its pressure on Kosovo in the past year, with one high-level American diplomat seemingly threatening Kosovo's ruling government in a news interview. This past March, a much-awaited meeting took place in Ohrid, where Kosovo and Serbia agreed to, but did not sign the European plan for the dialogue. Observers paid the most attention to a particular article of the 11-point plan, which would require Kosovo to, quote, ensure an appropriate level of self-management for the Serbian community in Kosovo, end quote, and to do so in accordance with previously reached agreements. Critics of the association see it as an additional level of governance, a state within a state, which will lead to the Bosniafication of Kosovo, referring to the Republika Srpska entity in Bosnia and Herzegovina, also an imposed creation of the international community. But details are still scarce, and no one seems to actually know what the association will look like. I have two guests with me today to discuss the competing narratives around the association, as well as what this process tells us about the region's relationship with the EU and international community at large. Augustin Paljoka is the Brussels correspondent for Koha Group and has been following the dialogue for over a decade. Adi Cherimagic is a senior analyst at the European Stability Initiative, a European think tank developing policy ideas on Southeast Europe, asylum policy, human rights, and democracy. Augustin, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Adi, it's great to have you here with us as well.
It's always great to be with you. Thank you.
So, Augustin, I'd like to begin with you, since you've also been covering the EU-mediated dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia since its very beginnings. And you've also followed the contested debates and oftentimes the tensions that have taken place in Kosovo's political scene, either in parallel to the dialogue or as a response to it. So can you talk a bit whether you think that the political discourse surrounding the association has changed over time, particularly among political parties in Kosovo? And also, do you think that public sentiment has changed in any way since 2013 to now?
I think that both have changed, the public sentiment and the understanding of the ruling party, the government. My opinion was all the time that this result of dialogue, agreement to create association/community of Serb-Majority municipality, was a wrong decision, but nevertheless Kosovo had no choice than to implement it. That's why I thought from the beginning that Albin Kurti and his government are waging a lost battle. It was known in the beginning that if you have European Union, all major member states, including Germany, France, Italy, if you have United States supporting it, and upon everything you have a huge majority in Kosovo Assembly that adopted it, you have no choice. So now they came to the understanding that since they cannot go all the time against the will of those nations that support Kosovo, and they cannot have required majority to withdraw the decision from the parliament, there is no other choice than to implement it. But the sentiments are that this is what we have and we are obliged to do, not necessary that we support it because it's a good solution, because it is not. You could hear sometimes privately, even in Brussels, that some mistakes were made at the beginning, and it's difficult to renew things and redo it again. And that's why we have now this situation, which is not fully clear, because the agreement as such was created also in a way that it leaves the space for interpretation. But interpretation are not, how to say, harmless, like EU would like to present them, because it's not easy to hear from the Serbian point of view, including Serbs in Kosovo and Belgrade, that the Ivica Dačić, then prime minister who signed the agreement, immediately after signing, he said that with this agreement, we made sure that never an Albanian prosecutor can prosecute a Serb. So he immediately started to put an ethnic element into the decision, which made the decision anti-European and discriminatory towards the others. So, but this is what we have, and now the time has come that they find the way how to implement it.
And if you can just continue a bit on the public sentiments around it, because you said that you think that those have also changed in the course of the past decade?
Well, I haven't done the survey, but I feel that the public opinion is aware that that the Kosovo has no choice than to implement it, and there is a price to pay if Kosovo implements it, but higher price to pay if it doesn't. So, in this sense, I think that it's kind of rational or accepting the reality, because this has been for a long time a main focus of international community and main element of pressure towards the Kosovo government.
Adi, I think that at the same time we can talk about the fact that much has changed also within a larger geopolitical context. Today there is war in Europe. The EU's attention has naturally shifted more toward Ukraine. We know that the EU enlargement process for the Western Balkans has more or less stalled, and we cannot also ignore Russia's increasing influence in the region. And I think we're also seeing the EU and even the US being somewhat more impatient toward the region in general, and then specifically towards Kosovo and Serbia and the dialogue. And another layer specifically toward Kosovo, I would say. They've also included these kind of conditions of non-compliance in the Ohrid agreement towards Kosovo and Serbia. So can you talk about how you see what happened in Ohrid within this larger context?
I would argue that the form of the agreement in Ohrid, which was not signed, and the content of the agreement that was made in Ohrid actually reflects not only the positions of Kosovo and Serbia, but also the strength or lack of it of the EU and the US vis-a-vis the region. I think that you rightfully pointed out that inside the EU, but also in the US, there is a growing sense of urgency when it comes to either solving or having a stable path towards solving the issues between not just Kosovo and Serbia, but also in a wider context, the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but elsewhere in the region. They've seen that since invasion of Ukraine by Russia, things between Kosovo and Serbia have continued, so to say, to escalate, have continued to not to be in a form of a dialogue leading to an agreement. So there is a sense in the EU and in the US that something needs to be done. But at the same time, the feeling is more of Kosovo and Serbia or the countries in the region should do more, while at the same time we, the EU or we, the US, should not step up our efforts or our offer to the region that could or should make any kind of stabilization and improvements in the region possible. So the agreement in Ohrid, if you look at it, the only thing that's being offered to the two sides is the EU membership perspective. The agreement is becoming part of the EU accession process. Its implementation will be linked to the path towards the EU, but at the same time, both sides, both Kosovo and Serbia, are aware that the EU path, is not as realistic or not as tangible as it seemed 10 or 15 years ago. So the fact that it wasn't signed, the fact that once the sides went home, started to interpret it in their own way, in their own interest, I think is also a reflection of this lack of strength or lack of the offer that the EU and the US, so to say, have for the region. And I think in midterm or in a longer term, this is going to come back and bite both those that have negotiated this agreement, but also the two sides, if they really want to work on the dialogue. Because unless EU has some kind of offer, unless EU gives some kind of a perspective to the two sides, then the one side that should be giving a recognition to Kosovo, that should be giving a path to Kosovo to become part of the international of some of the international organization or some of the regional organization. If we talk about the EU and the Council of Europe in that sense, has nothing to get except to then demand from Kosovo concessions, be it in territorial or be it in some other way. So in my opinion, what happened in Ohrid reflects quite a lot the lack of the strength of the EU and the US at the moment.
I would like to get a bit now, maybe more in depth, and to talk about the association. And Adi, I'll just stick with you a bit more, and because I mentioned earlier this phrase that has been recurring with regard to how the association is described, that it would lead to Bosniafication of Kosovo, and this started 10 years ago, but we've really seen an increase of this phrase being used over the past couple of months, and of course it's being used very much as in with these negative connotations that are ascribed to Bosnia's political and legislative structures. So I would like for you to just break down how you understand this this label, and whether it stands in a way, if we can have a bit of a compare and contrast to the extent that the association would, I don't think necessarily it will resemble the way the Republika Srpska entity has been set up, but what has led to this phrase coming about?
Well, I think I will start like this. I think that there is quite a lot of misunderstanding, not just in Kosovo, but elsewhere in the region and also in Europe and elsewhere, about what is Republika Srpska, what is its position in the constitutional and institutional architecture of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I think it would be really unrealistic to think that something as strong or as strong, let's put it like that, would be possible to be developed in Kosovo or anywhere else, because Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina is both territorial and administrative unit with its own competences in many areas, from deciding on how the healthcare is provided to agriculture policy, law, legislations, to many other areas which are important for society to exist or to function. At the same time, this territorial unit and administrative unit, Republika Srpska, has its share of power at the state level, which has of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which has competences like foreign trade, customs, or since after the Dayton, also in the area of armed forces and a couple of other competences. As such, as a territorial unit, it has not just a part of the power over these policies at the state level, but it very often has also a veto power to stop certain policies, laws, or decisions being made. At the same time, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, next to these territorial independence or territorial competences and powers to veto, we have this ethnic division of certain aspects of power. So at the state level, the power is not just divided among those, is not just divided among territorial units of Bosnia and Herzegovina that are represented at the state level, but there is also this ethnic key, which then provides certain all ethnic groups a powers, but also vetoes in decision making. So for almost all positions that are filled by Serbs at the state level, they are coming from Republika Srpska. So the Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, to conclude, has its own territorial and administrative competences, from agriculture, as I said, to health, to education, to many other aspects. As such, it has power to co-decide and influence decision-making and veto decision-making at the state level, but at the same time, most of the Serbs working or having powers at the state level to protect the ethnic aspect also come from Republika Srpska. So there's quite a lot of power, not just independently to decide on certain issues, but also to co-decide at the state level. So it's quite a powerful institution. One important thing: this kind of agreement, this kind of a constitution, this kind of a framework came about as a result of a bloody war with 100,000 people, with genocide, with expulsion, and it was agreed upon during the war as an attempt to end the war. So those who were on the other side or third side were keen or were willing to accept such a robust framework for functioning of the state, because it was a matter of a death and life. And since the peace and since we have the Dayton Peace Agreement, also in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a lot has changed. But what remained is Republika Srpska and its powers at the state level.
And Agustin, I would like to invite you actually to talk about this Bosnification of the Kosovar term, because I think from the Kosovar perspective, because I think maybe from here it was pushed very much by Vetëvendosje, but I think also maybe for citizens seeing sometimes how these power sharing structures in Bosnia between Republika Srpska and the Federation have often led to difficulties in running state affairs. And I think it has created concerns and worries for Kosovars that we would be facing similar problems like in Bosnia if the association was created. So if you can just talk about how you see it from the context of Kosovo.
I think I just wanted to remind a little bit on the history. The international community, they usually say we never do mistakes, but we learn lessons. So they said that we learned many lessons in Bosnia and we will not repeat them in case of Kosovo. This started in 1998 when NATO was saying we will not let Bosnia be repeated in Kosovo. That was one of the main reasons for military intervention in Kosovo. Then during the status negotiations, they made sure that Kosovo is independent. Even today, Bosnia is a part of international community, member of all organizations, but Kosovo is more independent than Bosnia legally, because there is no international representative who has executive powers to impose the laws or something, while in Bosnia you still have this. But one mistake was made, and this was made after they promised that they will never make these mistakes. Just to remind you that Ahtisaari proposal and the negotiations for the status had as a principle that Kosovo will be a Kosovo state of its citizens without national elements, ethnic elements. Even the map of Kosovo, the flag, anthem was done not to have Albanian ethnic elements. Then you have a proposal which start to introduce ethnic element into the kind of administrative structure. Another element is that the European Union never made clear what not only the association but other things in the dialogue are about and what they are not about. So this approach of so-called constructive ambiguity, to leave the sides opportunity to interpret in different way, was meant to be a good tool to overcome differences, but it created the real problem on the ground. And we have now to think how all three parts understand association. First of all, is it association or is it community? Because in all languages, in Albanian, asociacioni bashkia, in English, association, community, in Serbian, asociacija zajednica, are deliberately using two terms that are not the same. They might be similar, but they are not the same. Why EU allowed it? Just to make it easier to manipulate. So from the beginning, manipulation was part of the deliberate exercise. And this created in the ground the problem. Then I agree that Republika Srpska, it's much higher administrative, it's even state within a state. Then it will not be like that in Kosovo. But in practical term, it can make Kosovo suffer as a state. The functioning of the state can be blocked as it is blocked in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Just maybe easiest example for Kosovo citizens to understand is that Bosnia cannot recognize Republic of Kosovo just because of the veto of Republika Srpska. And it can not make clear an aim to join NATO. Bosnia has a membership action plan to join NATO, but Republika Srpska doesn't want membership of the state in NATO. So they are in a bizarre situation. They are in the process of joining, but they have no formal decision to join NATO. So this creates a lot of problem. Then we have the attempt by Belgrade to use Kosovo Serbs at this moment through a political party to block developments inside Kosovo. And they are managing it because Kosovo constitution has this double majority voting in many important issues. So if you don't have majority of Serb representatives in the Kosovo assembly, you cannot change the constitution. You cannot impose some major laws. And this is already happening through a political party. So the fear of Kosovars that with association, Serbia and the Serbs will block it more, it's a right fear. They have right to fear that. Another problem is that the main problem is that where is this association going to be? In the Kosovo and Metohija as part of Serbia, in the Kosovo as an entity that is not recognized as international as a sovereign state, or in the Republic of Kosovo. Lajčák and many EU officials were telling us that they have some 16 examples of local or regional or self-management for minorities, which do not endanger the existence of existing state. But when I ask them, do they have any example in Europe where this community that has those rights does not recognize the state where they live? And when they say our government, they don't mean the government of the state where they live, but of a neighboring state. You still hear the Serbian leader saying that Republika Srpska is in order to ensure that the Serbs in Kosovo and Metohija live equally like in any part of Republic of Serbia. So we have many practical problems that it's not easy to resolve just with taking decision to implement an agreement that was reached almost 10 years ago.
And Adi, maybe just to connect here with you quickly, because you talked earlier about the difference between how Republika Srpska entity is set up and why, and the differences with what the association could be. But still, in the context of our region, with a lot of unsolved political issues, with a lot of tension, I think I might say time after time, how do you see an association formed around ethnic lines potentially leading to troubles? Augustin talked a bit about that, but in the longer term of the region's future within the EU, do you think that actually it's only it's subject to cause troubles no matter what? Or can you comment a bit on this?
Yes, of course. What I always struggle to understand when I speak with colleagues from Kosovo and those who are very much not in favor of forming this association is when they use the example of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska, is if they use it as as an example of what needs to be avoided and what needs to be make sure that in case of Kosovo doesn't happen, so that we then discuss the forms of some kind of rights for Serb community in Kosovo, or we just use it as as a shield not to discuss at all about the issues at stake or the issues that have been agreed upon to be discussed and to be done. Because once one starts to discuss it in a way to say, look, Kosovo wants to join the EU, Kosovo also says that it wants to join the NATO, and we want the country to be democratic, to be based on a liberal democracy, a member of the Council of Europe, etc. Then let's discuss what are the forms in which we can give Serb community in Kosovo some kind of self-management or also competence or rights to organize parts of their public life with an aim not to allow for a dysfunctional state or a state that wouldn't be a liberal democracy, etc. Because once, if that's, then one can discuss different ways of how can that be organized. If you look at for example, European Commission annual reports on how prepared countries that are in the process to join the EU, you will find out that, in fact, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is portrayed, and it is very, very dysfunctional, in which we spoke about Republika Srpska and its powers, we spoke about political differences, but it ends up to be as prepared as Kosovo is, or just slightly less prepared than the Kosovo with the latest report from the last year. So the question is, if this is all the truth, why doesn't Kosovo use the possibility to influence the laws, the standards, the legislation, etc., to improve or to become more ready for the EU, to show, what is in this process, what is it defending, or what is it not defending. So I think one can keep this narrative of, we don't want Republika Srpska, we don't want Bosnianization of Kosovo, etc. And that can be, at that level, can be very effective, because the image of Bosnia is as it is, as a dysfunctional and difficult country to govern. But at the same time, I think one needs to think, do we want to talk concretely what needs to happen for the Serb community in Kosovo? And do we want to concretely show why this level of independence that the Kosovo institutions and Pristina has as a non-federal state compared to Bosnia and Herzegovina, to show that having these rights, means that we do reforms and we do improve things, and we show that, that it makes sense for us to have all of that.
If I can jump just to compare with some so-called European examples, the problem with those examples are that almost all of them are based on language communities, not necessarily on ethnic communities. Like they mention the rights of German-speaking community in Belgium. It's a very small community, less than 1%, but because of them, German is recognized as a official state language, but it is in use only where the Germans live. Plus, as I said earlier, they never say our government in Berlin, or we want German boots on our municipalities to protect us, etc. But and many people in Europe, they don't know. Sometimes they get surprised when I tell them that with those examples, Serbs might lose some of the rights that they have in Kosovo. In sense of language, because Serbian language is equal to Albanian as an equal state language of Republic of Kosovo in entire territory, which is not the case in Belgium with none of the official languages, because they are official languages. But apart from Brussels, who is bilingual, other parts are purely monolingual. And in Flanders, it's in administration, it's even forbidden to speak other language than Dutch. So that sometimes they jump. It's not that Kosovo is refusing to have European example. And by the way, some people in Kosovo rightly believe that once Kosovo joined Council of Europe and somebody complains, it might end up to have another Sejdic-Finci case in a lower regional level. Because if they would say a municipality with a majority-speaking community, it would be easier legally even for Kosovo Constitutional Court to approve it, and in the future, Venice Commission or something. Because you have a political agreement with which is set up who can become what ethnic background has to be a chief of police, prosecutors, and a judge. And you don't have others who live in Kosovo, like Bosniaks, Romas, Montenegrins, and others. So this was a mistake that was done in the beginning, and they didn't think enough. It's just like the Dayton Agreement. It was a very kind of fast food approach. We have to have a deal to stop the war. But nobody at that time, I spoke with the late Richard Holbrooke many times, and he said that he didn't have in mind that this might turn to be a basic document for the state to function in 30, 40 years. But it is the base on which Bosnia-Herzegovina still functions. So that's why international community should be careful not to impose some decisions that can create in the future more problems that they can resolve.
And Agustin, I would like to, Adi, you want to connect there if you can, because then I wanted to go back a bit about specifically this constructive ambiguity that Agustin talked about in the way the EU, but also the international community in general sometimes uses language. But Adi, please do connect.
Just briefly, I think that the point of introducing these different models at this point by Miroslav Lajčák and in the dialogue was, in a sense, to try to reconcile this agreement from 2013 and the implementation agreements and what they've included as a framework for this organization of Serb community in Kosovo, and the fact that there is a constitutional court ruling by the Kosovo Constitutional Court, which actually says that what was agreed, kind of much of it is in a sense not possible at the practical level to be implemented. So I think introduction of different models is not to take one or the other model and copy paste it on the case of Kosovo, but it is to kickstart a debate or a discussion or a conversation, or to give an inspiration to Kosovo government to come up with a more concrete proposals of what they envisage could be, but that it is in the same time in accordance with the Constitutional Court ruling. That was just one small point.
Yes, and actually, I wanted to continue some of these points with Agustin. So I mentioned this constructive ambiguity, Agustin, that you were talking about earlier, and I think we see a bit of that also in the Ohrid Agreement, because it says it calls for an appropriate level of self-management, but what appropriate level means is open to interpretation and it's open to understanding. So potentially it can be something that can drag on into the relations between Kosovo and Serbia, but then also to link with the ruling of the Constitutional Court. We should expect now that what was decided by the court is going to be taken into account with how the association moves forward, correct? I mean, at least this was the case in 2018, when at the time it was Mogherini, and at the time she did say that the association will move forward by respecting also the ruling of the Constitutional Court. And I was reading an article from 2018, and it reminded me that it caused a lot of outrage at the time in Serbia that the EU was open to was actually saying that the association has to move forward in accordance with Kosovar laws. So how do you see all of this now moving forward?
Well, I see it as a continuation of mistakes in allowing ambiguity that creates troubles on the ground. Let's just take police, for example. The Serbs insist that there is obligation from Kosovo not to send special unit of police in the north. And the EU is silent. Only when we insist, they ask, and they say there is no such obligations deriving from the dialogue. But then they add, it became a common practice not to send. So if you accept not to send any kind of police, then you go contrary to what you claim to have achieved in the past, like integration of the parallel structures. So that's why sometimes, from the sake of stability on the ground or political correctness towards the parties, they don't clarify things. And with clarification, they would help a lot to maintain or create stability on the ground. The problem with this ambiguity is that it continues. And you mentioned Ohrid agreement. It's less ambiguous than the previous ones because, yes, it mentions self-management. Okay, this was to allow Kosovar part to claim that it's not self-administration, but it's self-management. You can self-management a company or something while administration is administration. But there is another sentence in the same point that says that all previous agreements have to be implemented, which includes the agreement on association. Then we had an example when Lajčák was in Kosovo, and he said that, yes, association has to be created in accordance with the ruling of Kosovo constitution. Same day he went in Belgrade and he said that constitution is not a Bible. So constitution can also be changed. This is this problem that they create. Maybe they are aware of that or they are not, I don't know, but they should stop playing with this ambiguity because people are not stupid. Albanians, not in a big numbers, but they still understand Serbian language. The Serbs can translate or have understanding what Albanians are saying. So it's you cannot achieve reconciliation and normalization without making things clear. Then, is this an international obligation of Kosovo? It's not, because this is not international agreement. It was never ratified and accepted by Serbia. So, and it is not signed by European Union. In the end of the day, it was never signed even. It was just initiated in 2013. But Kosovo, with the decision of the parliament, made it obligation for itself. So yes, Kosovo has obligation, but it's a political international obligation, but not legal international obligation. Otherwise, somebody would put this issue into International Court of Justice or somewhere else. The understanding of European Union, and this was right, was that Kosovo Constitutional Court didn't rule that agreement is against constitution. It says that agreement has to be implemented, and during implementation, they have to take into account this and this. So basically, Constitutional Court gave guidelines how to implement it in order to be in accordance with Kosovo Constitution. And this is what United States, Germany, UK, and to a certain extent, but more tricky, European Union is saying. But then we have interpretation by Serbia, President Vučić saying that, well, we don't care about bilateral letters exchanged between Mogherini and Kosovo Prime Minister. When Mogherini explained that to the EU understanding, this does not constitute third layer of government or executive powers. So Serbia chooses to say that this is bilateral and it doesn't oblige us. But in other case, Serbia considers a bilateral letter sent by then Prime Minister Hashim Thaçi to NATO Secretary General not to send special units of Kosovo Security Force to the north without prior consent of the KFOR commander. This is obligation of Kosovo. So when it suits them, they say this is obligation, but in another case, we don't care because it's bilateral.
These are all great examples to kind of take me into my next question. And Adi, I'll throw this one at you. It's I do think that we can say that when it comes to the EU, there is a double standard in terms of how it approaches Kosovo and how it approaches Serbia, especially when it comes to the dialogue and the political issues. And we've seen it, I think, it's always been there, but I do feel that we've seen it increasingly more, and especially with the pressure that was being put on moving forward with the association and the pressure on this specific government, which initially was a bit more reluctant to continue, but then basically had to continue with the dialogue. So in Kosovo, but in also wider circles, there is this I would say observation or even sentiment or feeling that Serbia kind of gets to benefits more from all of these processes. And let's go back to this plan that was signed in Ohrid, because besides the association, it also includes other things. But we end up, of course, talking more about the association, because it includes even things like recognition of diplomas, a recognition of stamps, of a lot of other issues that have also been discussed a lot already within the framework of the dialogue since 2011 and 2013. So why we don't see the same kind of pressure on Serbia, also knowing, for example, Serbia is one of the few countries that has not moved forward with sanctions towards Ukraine. So the EU kind of chooses to also close its eyes towards certain policies and politics of Serbia. So how would you evaluate and comment on all of this?
I would maybe go back 10 or 12 years ago, or even longer, and see how Serbia behaved, or how Serbia was ready to engage in dialogue, and was ready not just to say that it agrees or supports the agreements, but actually to sign certain agreements, and to then follow up with a concrete implementation. If we go back to 2013 Brussels Agreement, but also those that came before and the after, we have seen not just, building of the border between North Kosovo and Serbia, not just inclusion of police and judiciary in the institutions of Kosovo as a state, but we've seen many other steps in the right direction, I would say, from Serbia when it comes when it comes to its treatment towards Kosovo. Of course, it was not. It hasn't solved. It didn't solve everything. It didn't go as far as it should have. But the recipe for these, I would say, positive and encouraging steps by Serbia in the case of Kosovo were possible because at that time Serbia both needed the support from the EU, but also expected and was given steps forward towards the EU. It became candidate country. It started accession talks. It got quite a lot of positive steps, so to say, towards the EU membership. And I think that's a recipe that we need to go back to, again, if we want to see what was agreed in Ohrid, or if we want to see new agreements coming out and pushing things further. I would say, for me, Ohrid Agreement more or less is everything that has been agreed in the dialogue in the past 10-ish years, put together on the same paper, and kind of, two sides said, we'll try to make it a bit more serious from now on, because in fact, in the past 5-6 years, everything that was agreed in the dialogue has more or less collapsed and has not, has been reversed. So I think if we want to see Serbia making concrete steps, if we want to see Serbia using its influence on the Serb community in Kosovo, or allowing Serb community in Kosovo to have its own voice and to show its own interests within the institution and within the country of Kosovo, I think EU cannot and should not expect Pristina and Kosovan authorities in Kosovo to give something to Serbia, but they need to be offering a vision not just for Serbia, but for the entire region, and as part of the EU, as becoming closer to the UN. And then, in that sense, I think we can see concrete steps. Otherwise, everything that President Vučić and Serbia have been doing in the past 10 years, and that is building a negotiating position through, closer ties with Russia, closer ties with China, developing state, close media that are anti-EU, that push anti-EU rhetoric, basically turning the population against the EU and against integration of the country in the EU, has all helped President Vučić and Serbian government to improve its negotiating position with the EU and with the West by saying, you don't have the power that you had 10 years ago, so now you need to give us something that is, on the other fields or on the other level. So I think if we want to go back to a better approach, not just to Kosovo, but also to Serbia and the rest of the region, I think the EU needs to step up its offer to the region, to Serbia and to Kosovo to join the EU.
Bez, I just wanted to jump on this because just to remind you that accession negotiations of Serbia are practically frozen. There was no decision about that, but almost a year and a half have passed since they opened the last chapter. And this has nothing to do with Kosovo. And I'm afraid, coming back to what Adi said at the beginning, that the EU is not in the position to offer much. Even if Serbia would recognize Kosovo today, I'm afraid that countries like Baltic states, Poland, and maybe Czech Republic would still block accession negotiations going on, because they care about Kosovo, of course, but they care more about sanctions against Russia. And until Serbia does not align with those sanctions, and until they continue to publicly say that how proud they are to be the only independent European country that does not support sanctions, it will have a problem in EU accession talks, because those are consensus-based processes. You see that North Macedonia a year ago had an opening, the first intergovernmental conference, but nothing has moved since. So here we have a case of Kosovo, which is waiting a decision by the Council what to do with the Kosovo request for membership in European Union. And speaking about Ohrid agreement, now international community is at a test. So we will have to see in next few months what Kosovo gets. If the Council of European Union does not give a mandate to Commission to work on an opinion on Kosovo candidate status, if membership in Council of Europe is not on the agenda in May, if Kosovo doesn't move towards participation in Partnership for Peace at NATO, where US will have to push things, if we don't go through Interpol and UNESCO, that means that this agreement was nothing, just another status quo.
So, and I'm going to move now into my last question, a bit different for both of you, but in the context of what you were just talking about, Augustin. Because I wanted to ask you, do you think that the pace of the dialogue will also change this year because of this pressure and because of everything that's been happening leading up to the Ohrid agreement? But you just talked also about the fact that also Kosovo needs to start getting something out of this. But can we expect a change in the pace or nature of the dialogue or anything in that regard? And then Adi, for you, for the last question afterwards, just, I mean, we've touched about this on and off, but what is actually the perspective of the region for the EU? I feel like it's just, we're going into this vicious cycle of conditioning after conditioning. And we saw also what happened to North Macedonia with the change name with Greece, but then Bulgaria stepped in with another issue. So, okay, what is our European perspective actually as a region? So I think both of you, and as for a last question for this episode, yes. Augustin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the dynamic will change. We will have a more dynamic in implementation, because as Adi said, not many new things were agreed, but there have to be implementation on the ground. So we'll have many meetings, new committee to observe the implementation and so on. And maybe we are going to see more robust intervention by facilitator in saying whose responsibility was if something is not implemented. Otherwise, it will be a new deadlock and actually backsliding in the dialogue, because what was achieved is minimum necessary but maximum possible. But it's far, far from what was promised when Lajčák got a mandate. 3 years ago, he got a mandate to push for the comprehensive final agreement between Kosovo and Serbia. And now 3 years after, EU, it's happy to say that we have no new status quo. Basically, I wrote in co-editor that this is a normalization of non-recognition by Serbia. So if this is a minimum necessary for any kind of normalization, I expect now big push and pressure from international community to implement things on the ground and to prevent new escalation. But unfortunately, this will also depend on what the sides can get in on other issues, like in European integration process for Serbia and integration of Kosovo in international and regional associations and organizations.
Well, I could spend next 2 hours quoting you nice words that we have heard in the past year about EU perspective of the region, from Chancellor Scholz to many surprising characters coming also, or speeches coming from Paris or from The Hague and elsewhere in the EU. But when it comes to practical terms, which are those that matter and those that can change the dynamic in the EU-Western Balkans relations, that still remains to be seen. What we've seen within the Berlin process, what we've seen from with decisions on the EU accession path, candidate status for Bosnia and Herzegovina, starting kind of accession talks with Albania and North Macedonia, all these decisions have been pending for years. So they are now just being caught up. And I think we will know what's happening on the EU Western Balkans front once we have the new government in Montenegro. The president elected, who was elected, but also parties that are running and they're doing well, are championing EU. They want to see reforms. They want to dismantle captured state. They want to see economic progress. That's what they say, although many fear that they might have some other agendas. That's what they say. And I think big test for the EU will exactly be Montenegro after the elections. If one country that is rather small, that is NATO member for years, that is Council of Europe member for years, that is aligned on the foreign policy front, despite all the internal and domestic issues, that is, that it will not influence decision making in the EU or the budget of the EU. If this country cannot be given a concrete and tangible and within years reachable EU membership after 11 years of negotiations, then none of the other Western Balkan countries can hope for something more concrete from the EU. And if the EU fails with Montenegro, it means that it will fail with all the others, and we will return to the dynamic that can be at best what we had in the past couple of years. At worst, it can be even worse than it is than it was in the past couple of years.
Well, Augustin and Adi, thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you very much for this truly insightful conversation. It was great having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other Talking Points is a K2.0 podcast. You can listen to it regularly on our website, kosovo2.0.com, or by subscribing to Kosovo 2.0 on Spotify.